SOLA seminar. Today we have a PhD thesis proposal presented by Xinxin Wang, and she will talk to us about this on the status and implementation of integrated green-gray infrastructure in residential street retrofitting. Thank you, Xinxin, for your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to say a huge thanks to my supervisors, Andreas and Wendy, for their continued support to my study. Without their support and encouragement, I wouldn't be here. So thank you, Andreas and Wendy, very much. As you see from the title, my central topic, central concept is integrated green-gray infrastructure, and the study context is in residential street retrofitting, and the scope is research status and implementation. So today's presentation will cover 5 sections. I will first quickly introduce the problem I'm investigating and the characteristics of the problem. And then I will quickly go through some key points in my literature review. And this will lead to my research questions, and followed by research design and methods. And the presentation will close by expected outcomes. So first, let me introduce the problem and why I'm studying it. So what's wrong with suburban residential streets? As we all know, since the early 20th century, residential streets in low-density suburban neighborhoods have been designed as car-oriented, wide paved spaces. As you can see from these 2 images, the top one is a typical suburban street layout. The lower one is a typical cross-section of these residential streets. So as we all experienced, these streets share some common characteristics. First, their primary function is to accommodate vehicular speed and movement. Their geometric features are wide paved surface with a high proportion for motor vehicles and narrow strips for utilities, sidewalks, and planting. And the network of these streets occupies a significant amount of land. In a typical suburban setting, sometimes it takes up to 30% of the overall land in the neighborhood. Because of these characteristics, these streets are associated with many problems. For example, the amount of impervious surface is also related to increased stormwater runoff, water contamination, and urban flooding, as you can see in the top image. Their car-dominated travel pattern also contributed to high car accident rates and high injury risks to cyclists and pedestrians. Also, their wide pavements and narrow plant strips also cause thermally uncomfortable to people walking on these streets. As a result of these drawbacks, green and green infrastructure have been promoted to retrofit these streets. Green infrastructure can be defined as all natural, semi-natural, and artificial networks of ecosystems within, around, and between urban areas across many scales. In the street setting, green infrastructure can be rain gardens, swales, or plant strips. Green infrastructure, as a term, is used to distinguish infrastructure from green infrastructure, which means the infrastructure that are not alive or green. So some innovative green infrastructure at the street scale can be permeable paving, cycle lane or street furniture. Although this infrastructure can be useful in retrofitting streets, however, installing these devices separately often causes disruption to the use of these streets, so the social economic costs often undermine their benefits. This problem may be addressed by integrated green-green infrastructure, especially by designing and implement them together. So what is integrated green-green infrastructure? It means that green and grey infrastructure work together, either at the component or at a system level. They can connected physically or functionally in various combinations. So these two pictures are examples of green-green infrastructure integration. The top one is a physically connected green-green infrastructure. In this example, the bus wheel and its curb are green and green infrastructure. They spatially connected together to form one device. In the lower part, this is an example of a functional integrated green-green infrastructure. As you can see, the bioswales, trees, and planting strips, they are not physically connected, but they are functionally work together to mitigate stormwater issues. So some research suggests that retrofitting streets with integrated green-grey infrastructure can potentially reduce cost, improve performance, and decrease spatial conflicts. However, we know very little about the research around green-grey infrastructure, including its integration within streets. This major research gap was identified by Alexandra et al. Based on a review of 15 academic papers published over 10 years. But their study has a few limitations. First, limited by the year of the study and available paper, the research findings are outdated. So there is a need for further research to update information. It is also possible that some cities may be implementing this infrastructure, but scholars are not studying it. These have been pointed out by several scholars, so we need to do further research to determine the extent that the green-green infrastructure are implemented. Furthermore, a number of researchers point out that the enablers and the barriers to their implementation have not been fully understood. So we need more empirical research to identify these enablers and barriers and confirm the extent they affect implementation. So to investigate these research gaps, I reviewed literatures published during the last 10 years. In this presentation, I will talk them in two parts. The first is what we know and don't know in terms of retrofitting research. The second part is what we know and not know about enablers and barriers to their implementation. So what do we know about their research? There is an early definition about green infrastructure that define it as a hybrid green and grey elements to various extents. To better categorize infrastructure at the street scale, Alexandra et al. Developed refined definitions for green infrastructure. As you can see from this slide, there are some quantified definition which is around 75% and 25%. According to this definition, if the ratio of natural-based material is greater than 75%, it is a green street infrastructure. If the man-made material is more than 75%, it's defined as a gray street infrastructure. So if the proportion of both green and green material are over 25%, it's become a green-gray street infrastructure. So we do know there is a refined definitions for green-gray infrastructure, and we also know that a street framework, a theoretical framework emerged from this study. There are some ecological frameworks in previous studies. First is ecosystem services. Second is landscape services. As we all know that for ecosystem services, it's usually for the study of nature-based systems. For landscape services, it's used to acknowledge human-based system and the landscape elements. However, either of these framework can help identify or categorize hybrid green-gray systems. In this research, Alexandra et al. Recognized nature and human-based systems and added this category into the framework and developed a street infrastructure landscape services framework. So under this framework, all the infrastructure elements can be categorized as these three types. So it would better facilitate the study of integrated systems. And we also have an understanding of different ways of integration. According to this study, there are two types of integration. They are physical integration and functional integration, as mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. In terms of the scale of integration, it could happen at component scale or network scale. For example, the component scale, it could be a biosphere with its curbs. Both green and gray elements make up one individual facility. In the network level, it could mean different types of green or gray elements work together across a street network to provide certain services. My literature review also identified some significant gaps. First, my review confirmed there are limited number. The number of study is limited. One evidence identified was that from the Alexandra paper, there are only 15 research papers within 10 years across North America, Europe, and Australasia. My own literature review also confirmed that during recent years, although the number is growing, but they are still very limited. The second gap is most of these studies are conducted by environmental scientists or traffic engineers. There are topics like stormwater intervention, traffic calming devices, but very few are studied by landscape architecture. So it seems landscape architecture as a profession has failed to address street retrofitting as a research topic. Another considered gap is between landscape research and practice. As several authors pointed out, there might be some streets are retrofitted by this infrastructure, but not studied by landscape researchers. So this is also a reason that contributes to the lack of knowledge about green infrastructure implementation. So what we don't know about the integration? When I looked at closer into those papers, I found out that most known integration occurs at component level. For example, this is a grass swale, consists of permeable paving and grass. So this is a component level study. So most known research are conducted at this kind of level. Very little focus on network level integration. Like this lower picture shows, there are very little research at this level. Another gap is some research focus on physical integration, like the overall arrangement of different infrastructure components, how they physically arranged across a street. But there is a lack of research into functional integration between various green and gray components. Another gap is there is a lack of research on how physical relationships affect their functional performance. For example, a number of research have studied how street tree and permeable paving could increase stormwater quality. However, we don't know if we put both street tree and permeable paving together, if they could cause conflict or if it enhance their performance. So there generally lack of link of what kind of physical relationship and how they associated with their providing services. So how about in New Zealand local context? Through papers in New Zealand context, we can see that New Zealand researchers have begun to explore innovative solutions for residential street retrofitting. As it shows from this image, there is also a growing awareness of multiple disciplinary collaboration towards integrated solutions. However, compared with the international literature, the number of studies on this topic is very minimal, and the research gap on green infrastructure is even wider. First, in terms of street retrofitting research, although many overseas retrofitting approaches were introduced to New Zealand, they have not been commonly accepted. Second, although local research, the second gap is local retrofitting research pays more attention to commercial area than residential streets. There are some studies that use Auckland CBD or other city CBD to investigate shared street concept or traffic calming devices, but very little is done in residential streets. Another gap, which is similar to the international literature, is most articles are published in transport and environmental journals the design profession, especially landscape architect, remains absent in street retrofitting research. And in terms of types of street infrastructures, from the local papers, we can see the focus of these studies is around the traffic calming and the road use behavior. Like this image shows in a suburban street of Auckland, the researchers proposed some devices to slow down traffic. But they mentioned some green elements, but environmental issues such as stormwater issue have not become the focus of these studies. So although in their street retrofitting design, they applied both green and gray elements, but the integration of these elements has not become the focus of these studies. Furthermore, we know very little about the extent that integration has happened and what are the barriers to their integration. So that was the first part of my literature review, which is investigate what we know and don't know from the current research. And the second part of the literature review is investigate enablers and barriers to their implementation. Again, from the literature review, some of the enablers and barriers are identified by researchers. It can be summarized like this slide. The known barrier from international literature is include local municipals' demand to retrofitting existing streets and the practitioners' wish to mitigate negative impact from climate change. Potential barriers pointed out by researchers include knowledge sharing among experts and collaborative governance to promote actions. And it's also a potential framework to develop that can enable analysis and the recognition of all infrastructure elements across the streets. In terms of barriers, some known barriers are researchers' uncertainty about the performance of the infrastructure or lack of knowledge of network level connection or researchers' lack of response to local nature and social conditions. Some potential barriers, including a lot, which include technical barriers, and administration barriers, and professional barriers, like a lack of a local standard or regulation. Although some researchers pointed out some enablers and barriers, because of these research suggested by these studies are not adequately backed up by case studies or have methodological flaws. So we are not sure whether these barriers and enablers are true, and we need to do further research to confirm their existence and the extent that they affect the implementation. And I also had a closer look to the New Zealand context. The local enablers and barriers are similar to the international ones. So things that could promote green infrastructure include, again, increasing demands from local governments and also growing awareness from practitioners. Barriers including innovative solutions in New Zealand are mainly used to design new streets rather than retrofitting existing streets. Another barrier is due to small number of research and projects. We know very little about the enablers and barriers in the local context. To quickly summarize the literature review, although there are some knowledge development over the last 10 years, we still know very little about their research and even less in their implementation. And we are not sure what are the enablers and barriers to green infrastructure research and practice. So this review conclusion leads to my research questions, which I summarized 3 questions. The first one is about what is the research status of residential street green infrastructure retrofitting? The second one is about the practice. What is the status of residential street green infrastructure retrofitting implementation in practice? The third one is about to continue investigate enablers and barriers to their implementation in both research and practice. So these are my 3 research questions. And so how I'm going to investigate them, I did a research design, which included 2 main methods. First one is systematic literature review. The second one is key informant interviews. So the research will be conducted according to phases. Phase 1 is a systematic review. The reason I choose this one is to ensure that the existing literature and the associated knowledge are thoroughly connected and systematically analyzed, so that to fill in the gap in current research. Phase 2 is key informant interviews. The reason I choose this method is to gain an in-depth understanding of the real-life practice of the implementation of green infrastructures. Because, as we mentioned before, there is a significant gap between research and practice. So there is a need to interview stakeholders and experts in this area to get a picture of what happened during implementation. The relationship between these 2 methods is through the first phases, I will fill in the current research gap and also identify questions and the directions for the second phase and identify case studies for the second phase interview. And findings from the second phase will also reflect back to the first phase to inform my understanding of the 3 research questions. So some key steps I'm going to take include, first one, I'm going to review internationally scholarly articles to understand what are the current research status. This will be done by a systematic review of peer-reviewed journal articles. Second step is to determine the extent to which integrated green infrastructure are implemented. So this will be done by key informant interviews with New Zealand stakeholders. And the third step is to identify enablers and barriers to their implementation. Again, this will be identified through the findings of both systematic review and key informant interview. The final step is I will compare all these findings and synthesize them to discuss their implications in residential street retrofitting. So after these 4 steps, hopefully I could answer the 3 questions and gain great insight into the research topic. Just a quick go through what this research method and process will look like. First one, for the systematic literature review, I will use a rigorous study process. To do this, I choose 2 guidelines. The first one is called PRISMA. It's preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and analysis. The second one is a handbook for systematic review. I will follow the guideline of these 2 documents, prepare a detailed checklist and protocol before starting my systematic review. And the steps I'm going to take include 5. The first one, I will develop several sub-questions based on my main question. The second one is I will design a detailed review protocol based on the 2 guidelines. The step 3, I will conduct literature search using 2 electronic databases and identify searching keywords and document all the searching process to make sure it's transparent and reproducible. Step 4 is I will apply exclusion and inclusion criteria to select all the eligible papers. It will include 2 screening process. The first one is abstract screening, and the second one is full paper screening. So after this process, I will identify all the relevant papers on this topic and extract data for further analysis. For the second phase, key informant interviews, I will first identify case studies from the first phase and also refine my research question. Hopefully, I will identify 3 to 5 New Zealand streets for further investigation. Using these streets, I will conduct quantitative semi-structured interviews with stakeholders, which means experts or designers that involved in these case studies. Of course, because key informant interviews will involve human participants, I will first complete the Lincoln University ethical application and get approval from the committee before doing anything with the interview. So again, the steps I'm going to follow are: step 1, I will developing interview questions. These questions will identified from the first phase of study, and it will be a set of open-ended questions, and I will run pilot interviews before decided what are the questions. Step 2 is I'm going to set up selection criteria for the key informants, and I will use snowball sampling to identify 12 to 15 key informants. Step 3 is the conducting of interviews. Each will be face-to-face or remotely, depending on the restriction levels in the future. And for each participant, it will take about 1 hour. And all the conversation will be recorded for further analysis. And step 4, I will analyzing interview data. It will include inductive open coding methods to help me identify themes and concepts emerging from the interview conversation. The expected outcomes will include 3 research papers and 1 PhD thesis. So the first paper will help me answer research question 1. The second paper will help research question 2. The third paper will identify enablers and barriers for their implementation and answer research question 3. The final paper will include an introduction across all 3 papers and a discussion of findings from all papers and an overall conclusion. So because I'm doing a part-time study, the process is very likely to be 6 years. So currently I'm in this area in the second year of my study, just got my proposal approved and holding the seminar and about to start my data collection process. And hopefully I will catch up later on, follow this timeline. I think that's all from me. Thank you very much for attending this seminar. Any questions?
Thank you, Xinxin. For our attendees, please feel free to open your mic. We're not many on the call, so feel free to open your mic and your camera and ask your questions.
I will go back to my research question if it's helpful.
I have a quick question for you, Xinxin.
Yes.
So you talk about choosing 5 different areas or 5 sites in New Zealand. Is that right?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Do you know which where are they located, or you haven't decided yet?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I haven't decided yet. As I mentioned, I will first do a systematic literature review, which including both international and local literature. From the systematic review, I will identify some New Zealand case studies, and then it will help me decide where are these streets located.
Okay, but all the 5 cases are in New Zealand?
Yeah, they are in New Zealand, yeah.
Okay. Did you think about the possibility that maybe the way different cities design their green and gray infrastructure could influence your data collection and could influence the way they're actually built? So because are you going to compare them, those 5 different cases, or not?
Yes, I'm going to compare them. Yeah, I think the way different city design them definitely will affect their performance or the research of these case studies. Currently, I'm hoping that these 5 case studies will cover different cities across New Zealand. For example, some case studies in Auckland, some might be in Christchurch or Wellington. So I'm hoping to have a variety of case studies across different cities.
So you're focusing
I could compare
on urban areas, not peri-urban or rural.
It's a like a typical residential suburban area with the low density types. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question.
Jackie?
Hi, Xinxin. Thanks for your